Hey guys, this is Smithy. Welcome to my channel. Today's video is a very well requested video, I would say. And today we're going to dupe the Hela palette from Odens Eye. This is the newest release that they did in collaboration with Angelica Nyqvist here on YouTube. I absolutely love Angie. So I would still pick up this palette, maybe on Black Friday, I would say. This palette has 16 beautiful shades and it would be the part of the legendary Diversity collection that earlier Judy, Annette as well as Tina from Fancy Face did. So earlier the palettes used to look like this and all the palettes earlier used to come with like 12 shades. But Angelica's palette is going to come with like 16 shades. So there would be like a slight price increase. Earlier, these palettes were like $35, but Angelica's palette is going to be $43.9. Odens Eye Cosmetics, it's a small indie brand based out of Sweden, and Angelica is also based out of Sweden. So she had like the whole theme behind this palette to talk about. I would highly request to go there to Angelica's channel. And if you are buying this palette, I mean, I'm not saying not to buy this palette at all. I myself would buy this palette, but maybe on Black Friday. Now, the only reason why I would wait for it is just because this palette is predominantly a green palette and I hardly wear greens on my eyes, but I would definitely want to support Angelica. Now, this is a Valentine's Day release. So this Odens Eye Hela palette is going to release on 13th of February, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So if you are based out of Sweden, I would say it would be released on 14th February. Please check the time zones accordingly. I would highly suggest you to go to Angelica's channel or Odens Eye's website or on the Odens Eye's Instagram. They would have everything listed down below. But without further ado, if you guys want to see how I duped Odens Eye's Hela palette with the palettes that I had in my collection, then please keep on watching. Now, I would say this is not like one or two palettes duped the entire palette because it's a very unusual color story. I've not seen like yellow, greens and like pinks together. I think the only palette that had like yellows and pinks together was the Kaleidos Flower Punk palette. So you would get like a similar vibe, but this is like with a lot of different textures and shimmers and beautiful grungy matte tones. So I would say if you are like a green lover, I would say you would absolutely love it. I think I would get the maximum use out of the second half of the palette. But yes, let's start duping. By the way, also the eye look that my eyelashes are popping out. So ignore that throughout the video because it's going to happen throughout the video. I know it. Also, so what I was saying is also the eye look that you're seeing on my eyes is replicating the eyeshadows that I'm duping out of this palette, and it would be at the end of the video. So stay tuned for that. So let's begin. The first eyeshadow in the palette is called Rebirth, and this is a pastel yellow matte shade, and this I have duped from the iconic London Sunset to Sunrise palette, and this is the shade that I am duping out with, and this is called Mimosa. Now, I hardly wear yellows, and this is the only palette that had yellow pastel matte shade with me, and that's why I am duping it with this. But I mean, this is a pretty dead-on dupe, I would say. So let me swatch it for you guys. I'll give you a close-ups of everything at the end of the video, also in the outside lighting too, so that you know. This again is a beautiful, very pigmented pastel matte, and so is Rebirth from Angelica's palette. It looks very, very similar. Now, the second shade in the palette is called Fluorescence, and it is defined as a firefly-like yellow-green shimmer. And as soon as I heard the description and when I saw Angelica swatching it, I immediately knew that this is going to be very, very close to this shade, which is called Fire Buds from the palette. And this is the Tiny Marvels palette from Sydney Grace. So let me swatch it for you guys. I mean, I love that shimmer. And this is the one that I have like in my inner corners today. Such beautiful pigmentation. I mean, yeah. If you go with like the first row of this palette, you will lean more on the yellow side of the eye look, I would say. It is definitely a green shimmer, but it has like a lot of yellow also in it. And that's why it like shines like that. And Sydney Grace eyeshadows, I mean, yeah, let's not start. Now, the third shade of the palette is called Underground, and this is defined as a ginger matte shade. I think the shade, which is very, very close, would be Odens Eye's Red Dragon palette, and the shade name is called Jade. I know a lot of people did buy this legendary Diversity collection. So if you do have this shade, you basically do have that shade also. And even I would say this shade, which is called Solar Flare, it's very, very close to the next shade that I'm going to talk about. So this is the shadow Jade, which is going to dupe the shade called Underworld from the palette. Now you can see that green also coming through. It's a beautiful green matte shade, especially for the crease. I think that's what Angelica also like wanted this palette to do. Very beautiful shade. I don't think this is going to be like a dead on dupe, but very similar, I would say. Again, if you do have the Dirty Martini palette, I think this Dirty Martini shade is going to be very, very close to that. So giving here all the options that you may have. Now the next shade in the palette is called Decay, which is like a matte taupe shade with a hint of green in it. And I basically knew that it is this shade, and this is called Extra Dirty from the Glamlight Dirty Martini palette. So again, if you have the Red Dragon palette, this shade Claw would be very, very similar to that. Also, if you do have, and I know a lot of people do have the So Jaded palette from Colourpop. If you have this palette, you have a lot of shades with you. This shade called Stoned. This is a beautiful cool tone brown shade, but it has a hint of green in it. You'll be very, very close to that shade called Decay. So let's swatch that. Look at that. And that would be the first row of the palette. I don't know why do I wear like full sleeves when I have to dupe such a big palette. Like, yeah. Will you learn? I don't think so. Okay, let's move on to the next row. The next shade in the palette is called Golden Bridge. Now this is a very beautiful peridot shade. And surprise, surprise, the shade called Peridot from the So Jaded palette is like an exact dupe to that. I would also say the similar shade to that, if you do have the Red Dragon palette, would be Solar Flare. This one. Let me also show you Solar Flare. So as you can see, these are the two shades that we're talking about. This is the Solar Flare shade and this is Peridot. But I would say, I think Peridot would be a little more closer, but you can definitely achieve the similar look using the Solar Flare shadow also. So I'm going to swatch Peridot. Beautiful. Now, when you move on to this row, it's going to be a lot more like green leaning. So let's move on to the next shade. The next shade in the palette is called Moss, and this is a beautiful mid-tone mossy green shade, and this has been duped by the shade called Jade from the So Jaded palette. Again, if you do have the Dirty Martini palette, I would say the shade called Dirty Vermouth would be also a dead-on dupe to that shade. So let's swatch. I'm going to swatch Jade. And oh my God. Beautiful. I love these tones of greens rather than going like a very grassy green, which also we do have in this palette. But this is like my comfort zone of greens. Now the next shade in the palette is called Venom, and this is like the brightest green of the palette, and it's a beautiful bright green shimmer. And this I have duped by the Hummingbird palette from Odens Eye, and the shade is called Feathers. I do not have any other bright green in my collection, and this would be the closest that I have in my collection. It's very, very close, but I would say that that is a little more bright. I don't know, but yeah. This is the shade that would dupe the shade called Venom in the palette. The next shade in the palette is called Auroboros, and this is defined as a retro dark green matte eyeshadow. And I would say if you do have the Legendary Diverse collection and you have the Giant Wolves palette, the shade called Desolate would be very close. I also feel if you do have that Raw Beauty Christie and Colourpop collaboration palette, which is called the At Forest Side, let me show. I think if you do have the At Forest Side palette, the shade which is called Emerald City would also be very, very close to it. But let's say if you do not have anything and you do have the Dirty Martini palette, I think you can get a similar vibe by mixing two shades, and that would be Garnish and Mix It Up. So I'm gonna swatch Desolate from the Giant Wolves palette because I feel like that is the closest. And this is how the second row looks like. Now you can see in the second row, we are going like a lot more on the greener side. As compared to the first row, it was a lot more yellow. The next shade in the palette is called Wolf. Now this has been duped by the Nabla Secret palette and the shade name is called Ghibli. Now I wanted to include this palette just because we can find a lot of like pinks from this palette. This is the shade that I'm duping out with. And this seems like a very neutral shade, but it does have like a lot of tan in it. And that's exactly how the shade is also defined as. Wolf is defined as like a tan brown matte shade. But also if you do have the At Forest Side palette, I think a very, very close dupe to that would be this shade, which is called Puffball from the palette. So yeah, definitely keep that also in mind. So let me swatch it. And that is the shade Wolf. It's very, very close to my skin tone, just a tiny little bit more dark. Perfect for like a neutral crease eye. You can also go a lot like neutral from this palette if you use this and that brown in the crease and go with any of the shimmers. That would give like a very neutral eye. And now we're going to move to the pink side of the palette. The next shade in the palette is called Hela, which has also been duped by the Nabla Secret palette, and the shade name is called Guilitia. And it's a very matte baby pink pastel shade. So I thought this would be like perfect for that. So let me swatch that. And that would be duping the shade Hela. These mattes from Nabla palette, like I love. You guys, it's not a news to you guys. If you have been like watching my channel, you know how much I love my Nabla mattes especially. I love it. I absolutely love it. The next shade in the palette is called Hellfire, and this Angie defines as like a peach shimmer. She said that this is like a true peach. It's not like very pink leaning or anything. And it's like a true peach shimmer. And this I am duping it with the shade called Anastasia from the Amrezy palette because I feel like this is a lot more peach shimmer. So let's swatch that. Beautiful. And I love that palette. I mean, yeah, I love Anastasia quality. And I feel like this is like a very, very close dupe to that. I would also say the similar shade for Hellfire, if you do have the Pat McGrath Celestial Odyssey palette, would be this shade, which is called Heavenly Body. Very, very similar shade, I would say. It's more of like a peachy pink shimmer. So if you do have this palette, you can definitely dupe that shade. The next shade in the palette is called Goddess, and this is basically like their hot pink shade in a matte format, and this I'm duping it with the shade called Pink Lady from Ofra Cosmetics. I would say even if you do have that Amrezy palette from Anastasia Beverly Hills, that has like this hot pink shade, but it is more on like a sheeny and a more shimmery format, and the shade is called Reezy. Very, very similar to this shade, but the texture is different. Similarly, even in the Nabla Secret palette, the shade which is called Big Experience is very, very similar to this shade. Again, this is a little more on the satin side rather than the matte. So I wanted to dupe it with the matte shade, and that's why I'm using Ofra's Pink Lady. And this would be the third row of the palette. Now we can see the palette going a lot more into pinks. And these, oh my God, this is such a beautiful row, I would say. Love it. Absolutely love it. Okay, now let's move on to the last row, which is my favorite row of the palette. I absolutely love the tones that she chose for the last row. I think that that is very unique and that is like the highlight of the palette. So let's start duping. The next shade in the palette is called Doublesided. Now this is the multichrome shade in the palette. Now I don't think that this shade that I'm going to dupe it with is a multichrome, but the shade and the shift is very, very similar. So I'm going to dupe it with this shade, which is called Hypersensual from the Nabla Secret palette. And you can see like that peach and the pink shimmer coming through with a gold in it. And it also has like a little bit of flecks of green also, and that's exactly how she is also defining that shade to be. And it is defined as, let me read out to you, it is defined as a multichrome with a golden pink and a green shimmer in it. So I think that this is very, very close to that shade. So let me swatch it out. I don't know if you guys can see it or not, because it is like an iridescent multichrome, and this also performs like an iridescent shade in that palette. So I'm going to build it up a little bit, I would say. I hope you can see that shade, like at least the shift, I would say. Like that peach and the pink and the green coming through with a gold base. I love it. I love this shade. I would also say if you do have Cleona's Ray shade or the Red Giant shade from Terra Moons, I think you can get very, very close to this shade. The next shade in the palette is called River, and I feel like this is a shade that is very, very unusual. I took a long time to dupe this shade, and I don't think that I'm like spot on with this shade, but I would say this is a very, very close contender to it. And this is from Pretties for Your Face, and the shade name is called Jolt. Again, Angelica says that it is like a multicolored shimmer shade with like a purple base, and that's exactly what Jolt is also. But I feel like her purple base from this shade River is like a very prominent in her shade. So let's swatch it. I'll show you how Jolt looks like and you can decide it for yourself, but I think you can get very, very close to that shade. It's a very shimmery, shifty shade. You can definitely see that like multi-colored dimension coming through, but it also has like that purple base. I would say this is the closest that I could get to that shade River. Again, this is Pretties for Your Face, Jolt. The next shade in the palette is called Suit, and this is like a blackberry matte shade from the palette. This is definitely necessary for deepening up any pink looks, even for that like mustardy tone looks. If you put this shade, this can transform a look into a different side altogether. And this has been duped by the shade called Blackberry from the Nabla's Cutie palette, and this is from the Wildberry palette. And I think this is definitely a dead-on dupe to that shade. It is like a very deep blackened brown shade with a lot more burgundy in it. And that's exactly what that shade is also. Such a beautiful shade. The last shade in the palette is called Complete, and this is like a black shimmer shade with a lot of silver particles. Now I would say if you do have the So Jaded palette, this shade called Onyx is again a black shade with silver particles in it. You can definitely dupe that shade with this shade. And also if you do have the Pat McGrath Celestial Odyssey palette, the shade that is called Black Noir, this shade is like dead on dupe to that shade. So let me swatch it. I'm going to swatch the Pat McGrath shade. Such a beautiful shade. And that is the last row of the palette. So let me show you the swatches of all of the palette together so that you can decide for yourself whether I did good in this duping department or not. And if you are like looking for a specific shade from that palette, if you do have any of these palettes, you can definitely dupe those shades. At least I think I've come very, very close to it. And now let's move on to the eye look that I created using these dupes. First, I took that shade, the matte yellow shade from the Iconic London palette, which is called Mimosa, and I dusted in the inner third of my eyelid and I blended it all across my crease. Next, I took the shade which is called Jade from the So Jaded palette and I applied that in my outer corners and I blended it towards my inner third of my eyelid so that my half of the eyelid is covered with this matte green shade. I also applied the Jade shade on my lower lash line. And then I deepened my outer corners with the shade called Stoned from the So Jaded palette, which is that matte cool tone brown with like a green tint in it. And this I basically did just to deepen out my outer corners and so that I can give a lot more depth to this eye look. And I also took the shade called Stoned on my outer third of my lower lash line so that I can deepen the entire look together. I went back and forth by blending my crease with that matte yellow shade, which is called Mimosa. And then for my lid shade, I used the shade called Peridot from the So Jaded palette. And that is all what I have in my inner third of my eyelid. And that is what gives that yellowy golden green shade on the eyelid. And then for my inner corners, I took the shade called Fire Butts from the Tiny Marvels palette from Sydney Grace, and I applied that to my inner corners. I finished off this eye look by using a black pencil eyeliner from Essence, and this is in the shade called Black Love. And I finished off this eye look by using Glamnetic lashes, and this is in the style Venus. And that is my final eye look. So I really hope that you guys enjoyed this video and you liked my dupes video for the newest Odens Hela Palette. If you did like it, do give it a thumbs up and also subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so that you're notified every time that I post next. I generally upload 3 videos every single week, every Mondays, Thursdays and Saturdays at 9 AM Eastern Standard Time. Until next time, I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye guys.